Belgium, where there was a child abuse case that being worked up, and next election collapsed again. And this has really weakened the environmental movement. I mean, in some ways, Greens went letting about what green politics means and become much more radical and much more questioning of conventional wisdom if we're going to have an impact and make an impact in time. And work together with, I mean, I've worked on a couple of commissions seeing that, and that's why now I've proposed recently that we create a permanent, or I know Buddhists don't like the word permanent, so let's call it an ongoing institution, which I call the World Future Council, which basically is based on ideas which the Dalai Lama, President Gorbachev, Václav Havel have come up with recent times, saying we need a sort of global conscience, we need a body which speaks out for our values, ethical values with you on this, also to learn your perspective working in the South on poverty and poverty eradication in an age of so-called globalization, because of course we don't really have any real globalization. We have an economic, corporate-led globalization benefiting the rich, benefiting a small minority. It's only terrorism, because of course it is the big threat to our global elite, who are not threatened by TB and who not really threatened by traffic accidents because they have a couple of outriders protecting them when they go out driving. Poverty is different. There are the statistics coming out, being churned out by various institutions, usually linked to the World Bank, which say that things are really improving. And there is the reality of people coming, for example, Gustavo Esteva, who lives in the slums in Mexico City, a former high UN employee, who says that the reality on the ground is much worse than what he sees from the them as fast as it has for the rich. So there is a justice issue there. But surely things are getting better for them. And, we have all these figures, and Vandana said you've got the wrong figures, you've got the wrong indicators since 20, 30 years, maybe even more. Because your indicators which just measure people's entry into the money economy, into the market economy, but they don't measure means and whether whether it actually means progress. Because I find quite often it means the modernization of their poverty. Quite often it means that people who are quite happy to drink water suddenly now think that, if you're thirsty, you must drink Coca-Cola. When I went to work in the Caribbean, I found that, you have a farmer can afford is a set with a corrugated iron roof in which the small children die of Petersburg during the day. And you get these sort of experiences when you're going to the Philippines and being interested in spiritual healers, spiritual surgeons in the Philippines, and taking the taxi one day in Manila to Cebu. But that really happens, because I think the basic human values are the same. They may be expressed differently, but they're just studied by the Institute for Global Ethics and other organizations. By people like our water city and Manuel Maxine from Chile, which shows that it opened doors. That sometimes we have real problems. We go to the capital and we try to go to some ministry to talk to the officials. But of course the doorman just looks at our clothing as poor farmers and he just shuts us out. We can't even get past the doorman. But after we got your award, the minister himself was standing in the door, waiting for us. So this is the kind of power shift which you can help engender if you ask people in very, very different walks of life in very different countries. And you just need to build on that and strengthen that. And one way we have done that is, through the awards. But even that, hasn't been enough. I have the feeling that we need to create an ongoing institution, which is this World Future Council initiative, like the global community. I go to these meetings with the World Bank, see all these northern NGOs, they're meeting all the time with the World Bank, but there was no platform for me to meet with me as a Democratic member of Parliament. We're trying to sort of test that by helping these MPs setting up an electronic network, this is called the e-Parliament initiative in the first instance, and provide all political credibility. And I think that is really the main problem today. You have this increasing distrust and lack of credibility because the gap between what people are doing and what people are saying is becoming so vast. And you see this among young people who are increasingly a largely negative challenge. But if you look at a country like Bangladesh, for example, you have a whole generation of young men, and I'm sure it's not like that, will be told that the future is business. So, they've gone to that it doesn't seem to stand any chance of doing that. Some friends of mine now from Austria and Germany have developed the concept of an ecological Marshall Plan. We need an ecological Marshall Plan to help the poor. We need to instigate a market economy. Because if we continue with this neoliberal market economy, we're going to face increasing collapse of our societies, of the environment, increasing terror, etc. And I said, yes, you're quite right, but who is going to do this? Didn't get anywhere. So I think we know what needs to be done, but we don't really have clear strategies to get from here to that. And if you say, well, what on earth is the World Future Council to do with this? Well, all I say, they have set up strong institutions with strong powers, the IMF, the WTO, etc., to run their show. And if they tell us all the time, we don't need new institutions, we should think why maybe that is. And, go in and try to work through their institution, you pretty much find that they are institutions representing us in our much broader perspective as citizens, as world citizens. Then I think, that is not the end of it, but it will be a very powerful shift. Humor, that it's not the question of creating some new ethics out of nowhere. Where it's supposed to come from? We have this. We are all citizens, and we've always been citizens. And consumers have just been a small part of that. A narcotic disease in Africa, because it is. Every one of us has a daily choice to be part of the problem, part of the which we can attack. But first of all, we need to formulate our alternatives in an ongoing way. We can't just have a commission or a meeting or some conference somewhere which produces a nice declaration which ends up on our bookshelves. And we have to see that now is a unique opportunity, because as late as the Johannesburg summit in 2002, the elites of the South, who, as I said before, in many ways, the agents of the North, but they still have must have some kind of responsibility for their people from the South, because they know otherwise they could check them out if these are too bad. They were basically accepting and supporting, promoting the Northern agenda of further global trade liberalization. With all of us, without exception, in Johannesburg. And then suddenly in Cancun, they said no. They said no because they were suddenly fed up with how little they were getting. They were getting afraid of their people. They were getting afraid of NGO networks like the Third World Network. Whose pressure, and it was a focus for the Global South, with our award recipient, Walter Fellow. Without these people, this would not have happened. But the southern government suddenly changed sides and said no more. So they know what they're against, that this sort of formative alliance of the southern governments and the NGOs formed to say no. But it hasn't yet formed on what to say yes to. And that, I think, is a huge weakness. It's a huge weakness that even the big movements have not developed this. I mean, when you hear a lot of talks in many years of Buddhist economics, I mean, it was a term which even E.F. Schumacher, who wrote about Small is Beautiful, brought to the West. And, we have some idea what it means in the detail, but what it actually mean in practice on the national level, I'd like to know. I mean, if tomorrow those who are talking about Buddhist economics are in power, what will they do differently? I don't know. I asked the same thing about Islamic economics. What is the answer of moderate Islam to the global crisis? When President Wahid, a moderate, really deep Islamic thinker, suddenly became president of the largest Islamic country on earth, and I said to his Minister of Technology, now what is Islamic economics? What are you going to do? And he said, I don't really believe in that, Islamic banking, it's not really working very well. We're going to call in the IMF. Now, of course, as moderates like that, it's not surprising that the extremists are getting more and more adherents. And I think that is, where our key work is now, and where each one of us can make a difference. I mean, we never know. I mean, I've learned this through my work. We never know when we're called upon to do something which can change the world. It can be a conversation we have, like happened to a little-known American poet, Gary Snyder, years ago, when the Vietnam War stopped. Why did the Vietnam War stop? Because the American government could no longer withstand the anger of the American people when they found out the secrets in the so-called Pentagon Papers, which had been hidden from them, about what the USA was doing in Vietnam. And how did they find out these secrets? Because one mid-level bureaucrat called Daniel Ellsberg decided at the risk of 30 years in jail and ruin and everything to leak these papers to the New York Times. What suddenly made him do it? Well, he was in Tokyo about a year previously, and he went into the hotel bar at night, and this poet, Gary Snyder, had been doing a poetry reading in Tokyo, and staying in the same area, and he happened to walk into the same bar and looked around, and he saw these other Americans sitting there, and they got talking And Ellsberg said to Snyder, what do you think about the war? And Snyder said, I think it's a criminal atrocity. And Ellsberg was quite shocked. He never actually met anybody with those opinions before. He lived in a very secluded environment. And they talked all night. And then, Snyder went home and Ellsberg went home, and a year later, it took him a year to go think through all the implications. Ellsberg sent a note to Gary Snyder saying, I'm the man you spoke to in the bar in Tokyo a year ago. That conversation changed my life. Watch the newspapers. And next day you release the papers to the New York Times. So, it matters what you do. It matters who you talk to, even in a bar at night. I think I'll stop there and be looking for questions.
It's challenging, not totally negative, because as you say, as human being, only trust the leaders and think that things will happen up there is maybe not enough. All of us can make a change. But I think this is an opportunity. I don't know which role you have in the World Future Council. Can we raise issues for you to bring into the council? And maybe we can also raise questions about, what is on the agenda now in the near future. Jakob.
I had the idea of the World Future Council, but based on similar ideas which had come out of the books and writings and speeches of Gorbachev and of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Václav Havel, etc. over the past 15 years, but nobody actually done anything about it. And I proposed it in a radio talk I did in Germany, and I then got a call from German television and said, we like this so much, if you can bring this about, we guarantee we'll televise it worldwide. And I thought, that's really quite amazing. Normally you work very hard to get something going, and you think, how can I get television interested? And here they come and they say they're actually waiting. So I said, look, I'm already responsible for one underfunded international initiative, namely the Right Labrador Award, so there's no way I could possibly take this on. So they even introduced me to our first ideas would be taken up. Well, we looked at, when I say we, this has been sort of a small group of volunteers really working on this. Louis Barber is the director of Earth Action, this network I mentioned to you before. We had a meeting in Salzburg at the invitation of the governor there with about 30 people. Tariq Banouri, who runs the Stockholm Environment office, Stockholm Environment Institute office in Boston at the moment, but is originally from Pakistan. He was one who actually said this would not just be a council of wise elders, it should be a council of wise elders, pioneers and youth leaders. So he's been involved. There have been a number of people from advising us and endorsing this idea. Chandra Musaffar, Sulek Sivaraksa has agreed to be on the initial board. We're now going to have asking about 10 or 12 of the endorsers, who include Nobel Peace Prize laureates and people on both sides of the spectrum, and people in NGOs, people very, very fighting in the campaign against the World Bank, but also interesting privately. The president of the World Bank also totally thinks it's a good idea. So it's an interesting breadth of spectrum. And of course, the devil is in the detail, as the Germans say. We'll find out what actually happens once the debates get going. It depends very much on the people you win to conduct them, to steer the debates. We've found that there are about 20 issues. We can obviously subdivide them further, which need global reform, beginning with good work for all, water, healthy food for all, looking at health and healing, looking at youth development, children's rights, various key environmental issues, justice, education for all. And it is quite clear that one problem at the moment is that these issues are dealt with in isolation. That when there's a problem, a commission is commissioned to come up with a report which will then say we need to lower the retirement age in the West because youth unemployment is getting so serious, so we need to have a lower retirement age. And then of course you have another commission which says we need to raise the retirement age because we can't afford to pay the pensions. And you have a commission which says it's really a worry for the global environment that the Chinese are buying so many new cars. But another one says it's really a worry for the global economy that the Japanese are not buying so many new cars anymore. And, it goes on and on and on. And so, for the first time, we said we will have all these issues under one umbrella, which means that we can link them. We can start saying, for example, why are all these energy-saving proposals which go under headings like factor 4 or factor 10, that you can have so much energy efficiency that you can have the same amount of well-being, but just use 1/10 of the energy. And I said to the authors of one of these books, well, I mean, entrepreneurs are not stupid. If there are all these niches, all these profits to be made, why is it happening? And they said, well, of course it needs financial reform, tax reform, reform of discounting regulations. The signals are wrong, which are being sent at the moment, so it can't be done within the present framework. But that's sort of like, that's not his responsibility. He's not an expert on this. So we said we need a framework where we can then have joint meetings with those who are experts in this, so we can come up with practical, actionable proposals, really with model legislation. And so at the moment, the wait is really for the funding which will enable the launch to take place. I think at the moment we're getting the kind of funding which in the next few months will enable us to start employing some key staff, including maybe a professional fundraiser. But I'm hoping within a year or so or less we'll have the kind of funding which will enable us to set up a launching conference, or even I prefer the word launching tribunal, because we really need to sit in judgment about what has to be done with our Earth, and then see which of these commissions there is enough energy for to get them going. I don't think that we want a huge organization with a huge secretariat running 20, or at the moment the list has 24 commissions. You'll find them all on World Future Council, all in one word, .org. I think that we need, ideally have like some host organizations, maybe host cities, but even better, credible host organizations to say, okay, we will be responsible for the commission on good work for all. And also looking for chairs for these commissions. There's a German professor, Richard Bergman, who's worked both in South Africa and in the US, so really has global experience on unemployment issues. I shared a platform with him and His Holiness the Dalai Lama at the German Church Days last year, talked about this. We had 20,000 mostly young people there. So there is a lot of interest. We are doing a sort of summary at the moment, what we call a World Future Report, where we are now looking for authors to just do a very short summary on each of these 24 issues, saying where are we at the moment, where are we heading to, and where could we be headed to, and what are the practical steps to go there. And then we'll find that in some areas there's something you can get a majority on tomorrow. Much of the transition to a sustainable energy culture is basically, the information is there. We can mobilize public opinion around that. People want it, north and south. They realize that all the solar energy of yesterday, which we didn't use, was wasted forever. So to have a situation where you compare the extraction cost of solar energy, of renewable energy, with non-renewables, when actually they are totally opposite. With non-renewable, as you know, it's the one you used yesterday, which is gone forever. With a renewable, it's the energy you didn't use yesterday, which is gone forever. So obviously we need to shift the way we calculate our energy use. And that you can get a majority for tomorrow. Just needs a concerted campaign for a World Energy Charter, for example. Hermann Scheer has been working on this. We could mobilize for that as soon as we can get the council going. Other issues like monetary reform are considerably more complex. You need much more education, much more research on that. So, it won't all happen in parallel, but I think enough will happen, quickly enough, and people realize that there is a body which is actually not just a talking shop, of course there are the parliamentarians linked to it, which is not just going to end up, producing a nice report, but which is part of a concerted process, not another competitive organization. I said everybody is welcome. We are looking for institutional partners, and we've had a couple of institutions who are become founding partners for this. It is not a competition. It's not another NGO. It's a process to bridge the implementation gap.
So, I'm looking for a hand, and if you have a hand, you can say your name and if you represent any organization, if you want. Oh, guys. Okay.
My name is Guy Horton. I work on mainly on the issue of Burma. And while I totally agree with almost everything you say and feel a deep sympathy for it, I have two questions in my mind as I was listening to you. And one is this issue of peace. And to ask you, really, what do you think about Rwanda's, about Sarajevo's, about Burma, which is very close to us here, when you have a situation where peace does not seem to work in in any way whatsoever. And this is dramatically illustrated by the situation in Aung San Suu Kyi's ambush last year. And she's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. She won the election. Her safety being guaranteed by the regime, by the UN envoy. She was very careful to make sure her followers did nothing provocative. And when the cars were stopped and surrounded, she asked her people not to resist, and they were simply cut down. And if you think of Rwanda, 800,000 people were killed there, and various other places. So one of the things I wrestle with in trying to find a way of responding to what's happening to Burma is the natural allies like yourself or people like here. I'm not sure how they can think about responding to a regime like this. And while I accept that huge numbers of people are being killed indirectly, lack of clean water, malaria and all the rest of it, on occasions huge numbers of people are deliberately, actively killed by these regimes, directly. And the West European pacifist, left-of-centre movement is not very good at responding to that. Maybe we don't know how to respond to it, but it is a fact. And the second thing is the uneasiness in my mind sometimes about the globalization issue. Because some of the leading anti-globalization politicians of the 20th century were people like Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, Stalin, Hitler. They were all deeply committed to fighting and ridding themselves from being enmeshed in some kind of international capitalism. And I don't know if this is true or not, but one of the reasons maybe why Pakistan-Indian War did not occur a couple of years ago was massive pressure from people like Microsoft saying that they might withdraw from India if a nuclear war took place. Now, I'm only being slightly devil's advocate here, but what I'm trying to do is just to share some concerns in mind about the issue of peace when confronted with diabolical violence and deceit. And sometimes maybe those people who are anti-globalization may be associated with nationalism that actually can create more violence. Do you see what I mean? I do deeply respect what you say, and I believe what you say, but it almost seems to me that you're coming from a sane, rational, humane world. And sometimes, those assumptions don't apply in Rwanda or Sarajevo or modern Burma.
When I was young, my father took me to the trial of one of the main Nazi butchers of the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. And I'd read so many reports of these trials, and they were sort of saying that these men were not, they were nice grandfathers, and why put them on trial again? And I know when I entered that courtroom, I was a little worried that this man would look like a nice old grandfather. I'd find difficult to feel any antipathy to him. And he looked up, and evil just shone out of his face. I'm convinced that, there is evil. And there are smaller or larger opportunities for evil. And of course what happened in these cases was that people who were disposed to evil and who had become neighborhood thugs suddenly had the opportunity to become mass murderers. And my father was a refugee from Nazism, and I wrestled a lot with the situation in Bosnia, where suddenly it seemed that we had fascism in Europe again. But what is the right thing to do? And I finally decided that I was not a pacifist, and that intervention, there was an international order built up in the United Nations, and if a country is a member of the United Nations and is aggressed, like Bosnia was, it has a right to expect to be defended by the global community. And I went back to my native Sweden, and together with the actress Bibi Andersson, we set up a new political party called the Sarajevo List to fight purely on that issue. And at the same time, when the Iraq preparations for the Iraq war began, I felt instinctively that it was totally wrong. It was not just a breach of the UN Charter, it was basically breaching the whole international order of the last 350 years without replacing it. But at the same time, I also have friends who worked on human rights there. I know the oppression, and it was always a struggle what to do. And I was helped by the statement of Viktor Frankl, a Jewish Austrian philosopher who survived the Holocaust, who said that sometimes the right thing to do is only 55% right, but you still have to act on these 55%. And I think that's very, very true. And so every issue I think it's basically has to be looked at on its own merits. There is no parallel really between, to me, Bosnia and Burma and Rwanda. So once you start looking at the details, and what happened in Bosnia was a clear aggression, which because the European Union couldn't get its act together, it tried to pretend was a civil war, and it's still suffering the consequences of creating a kind of apartheid, while the aggressors, i.e. not these Serbs, because we gave the Right Ladder Award to those Serbs in Bosnia who were working with the Bosnian government to preserve the multi-ethnic, multicultural Bosnia, the Serb Council of Sarajevo. But the Serb aggressors, the thugs, the terrorists, funded by Milosevic, they were given half the country. So I think that was a major mistake, and that's the reason why we are having the situation now with the ethnic splits now. What happened in Rwanda was quite clearly that one major power, namely France, conducted a policy there which was absolutely outrageous and prevented the UN, and the others didn't really intervene. France's role was the worst, but even the others didn't intervene. I mean, there was a UN general there who had a warning, clear intelligence what's going to happen, and he called for reinforcements, and he was not given them, and he's even told not to interfere. He offered to raid the secret arms dumps, and he was told not to do it. And he afterwards he became mentally sick because of what he felt he could have prevented if he wondered whether he should have just ignored the orders and just gone ahead and do it. And what's going on in Burma, I mean, reminds us again that although people like to think that the EU, Europe is a bit better than the USA, in this case, I mean, in the Burma case, the EU position has to be scandalous because there are these selective purchasing laws passed, for example, by the state of Massachusetts, banning state orders for any company, any U.S. company, or any company, U.S. or not, which does business with Burma, with the Kuta. And the EU has been suing the U.S., Massachusetts via the U.S. and through the World Trade Organization, trying to get this law declared to be discriminatory impediment to trade. So I think again there, no nation can really resist a total international boycott of its elites. But of course the Burmese rulers are not being boycotted or isolated. And there's even less excuse in many other countries where the alternative to the strongmen seems to be chaos. Because in Burma it's not chaos, it's all there. I mean, the elected leader is there. And so it's even more outrageous that the West, which claims to be interested in democracy, is not doing anything. And I think, again, the problem is that we are saying this here and we're saying this there, but I think we need to create a stronger ongoing voice which says this, who speaks up for our values as citizens. And that, of course, used to be the role of the churches or religious leaders. But as we know, they don't really dare to do this. And when they do it so weakly because they're afraid that if they do it more strongly and they aren't taken seriously, then it will just show how weak they are. And I mean, I was talking last year at a meeting organized of mainly of Christian leaders from all the three main Christian traditions, organized by the Patriarch of Constantinople, a meeting of scientists, religious leaders, and environmental leaders. And I said, we need stronger leadership from, if the churches are there, surely they must care about the planet, about creation, surely this is our role. What about excommunicating a few of the worst sinners and polluters? And there was kind of horrified silence. And finally one English bishop, old English bishop, stood up and said, no, the churches can only lead from behind. I said, well, what are you waiting for? He said, well, the only thing which can wake people up is a disaster in the rich countries. So I said, what are you thinking about? He said, well, like the flooding of London. I said, well, it's quite remarkable that here you have old English bishops going around hoping that London will be flooded in order to wake the believers up. And you have this, I've spoken in Switzerland, one of these, the churches are now setting up these centers for management training. But you go there and you find that actually the managers you meet there, the people from industry, from business, they are more open than these guys are who are running the show. This leader of the center was saying, well, of course, there was three ways of persuading people, and one is the moral way. But so that doesn't work anymore. Moral institutions have collapsed. And the state, of course, used to pass laws, and that doesn't work anymore because people don't like rules. So then it's just the way business does it, was sort of trying to attract people through as consumers. That's the only way. We somehow have to sort of formulate our message so that it becomes attractive to people as consumers. And I said, well, I thought I was at a meeting organized by a church institution, not by the advertising industry. So there is this bankruptcy of these existing institutions, and of course as a result of which people become very, very cynical about them. And so we need to recreate institutions which speaks up for us as citizens, because our elected governments are more or less in the pockets of consumer interests, and you know they will always look at the bottom line, and so all the time you will have been told, well, yes, we do appreciate your concern as a human rights activist, and you have brought us 5 million signatures now saying that we should really take stronger measures against the Burmese generals. But you must understand that yesterday we were visited by 5 businessmen who are responsible for creating 5,000 new jobs, and these jobs will be lost if we don't allow them to trade with Burma. And so we need a stronger international institution that basically says, look, this is totally irrelevant whether there are 5,000 jobs or not. There are more important things than jobs. There are more important things than making money. And if you don't do that, we are going to keep on denouncing and exposing you every day and make you into a moral pariah. And this is a method which no elected politician can resist. I mean, Lyndon Johnson resigned because if every day he left the White House he would hear the chant of LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? I mean, nobody can stand this for very long. Leaders from the private sector, when I say to them, well, what made you change? And they come and they are really sort of seeking. And they said, well, I was tired of my children telling me at dinner every night that I was destroying their planet and their future. So I think this is why we need to speak up and say it's outrageous. I mean, I speak to, I don't know how many different audiences. I always give this example. I say, now, if you lend a poor African, say a poor Burmese, $1,000, and he or she came back after a couple of years and repaid you $1,000, would you pursue him or her for compound interest on this money for year after year, even if you knew that money, the compound interest you were forcing them to pay you, was endangering the health and education of their children? Of course, nobody says, yes, I will do that. But that's being done every day by our governments, by our international institutions, by our banks in our name. And, if you look into the animal kingdom, which especially young people, care about, that's where we now have these terrorist organizations in Europe who care more about animals than about people, who are prepared to endanger people's lives to save animals. But they have just been so horrified by living in a Europe where this horses, cows, pigs, sheep, 25 million, 10% are dead on arrival. The half-dead rest is uneaten by us, those who eat meat. But it still pays. The system still pays. But of course, morally, ethically, and not just, these are not European values, they are not Asian values, they are human values. It's totally outrageous. But it needs to be spoken, daily with a stronger voice. The voice of commercial speech, which isn't just the advertisements we hear. It's these, business leaders sitting there, seeing our politicians every day, going to have dinner with them and saying, do you realize what this means, if you introduce this boycott, let the market, the market will somehow, look what happened in South Africa, sooner or later, we were able to, and then of course others say, no, it was the Dutch, it was much true, it was the boycott which stopped South Africa, the party system, it wasn't the companies who stayed there. And they might very well have provided slightly different terms than others, but it was the whole system, it was feeling that they were an international pariah, which made
Maybe it could use the microphone. Can you speak up?
My name is Eddie. I'm just an observer. I'd like to ask 2 questions. In the first part of the speech, you have highlighted the ideas of the Green Party or the Radical Party. How much members are in the European Union of this Green Party and Radical Party, in view of the fact that the election in France and Germany almost wipe out many of the Green Party? So how can you justify your party? That's the one question. And the second question is, now after Cancun, it seems that the World Trade Organization has collapsed or not because of Brazil and India and so forth. So what is likely the scenario for the World Trade Organization? And does the northern countries, does they admit that this because of globalization and because of the unfairness that the third world countries are suffering? Thank you.
exactly what happened in national politics in Europe. And I mean, the German Green Party at the moment is doing very well in the opinion polls because many people are so disillusioned with the Social Democrats, and Joschka Fischer is a very sort of charismatic politician, although I have very strong disagreements with him. But in other countries they have become so weak, as you say, and also the electoral system is such that they have managed to stay such a small party that they have made alliances. And in France now they allot themselves the Social Democrats, and they have done it in a couple of other countries too. And they actually did quite well in that alliance, which will then guarantee them a couple of seats. But in the new East European countries, they have basically disappeared. I mean, they exist. They are. How big are they? Well, some may have a few hundred, some may have a few thousand members. There's a European Green Coordination, which which meets. So there is a Green Party in every country, but in very few of these countries are they in parliament, and even fewer are they in government. And that was during the 90s. There were more of them. When the Soviet system collapsed, there was a time when you couldn't really declare that you were a liberal or conservative, but you could declare that you were a green. So suddenly there were these masses of greens in Eastern Europe. But then, when the politics changed, it turned out that they were not really greens at all. This was just a sort of politically opportunist thing. But in most countries, the system is still such that small parties are discriminated against. And the problem is that, to me, that the Green Party has remained a minority party because it did not highlight the issue. It had an issue which is the most important issue, I think, for our survival, but it sort of joined the existing streams and positioned itself somewhere inside the existing left-right spectrum, and found this niche, which is a niche where you sometimes get 3%, sometimes you get 7 or 10%. But I remember a friend of mine who is now also actually left and pushed out of the Green Party. He was in mainstream about 10 years ago. He was one of the men who wrote the program, former member of the European Parliament and a candidate in Paris, the suburb of Munich, so no fundamentalist by any means. But he always used to say, when the Greens were really 7%, and they said, oh, this really will end up from 60%. He used to say, when you look around the world, then anything less than 51% is the Green spectrum of an issue. And this was growth. It turned out that it was right. And that's, of course, one of the most successful propaganda lies of the established order, because the limits to growth report was basically true. It's just, they didn't get everything completely right. They underestimated the oil reserves probably by a few decades, So they'll run out 20 or 30 years later, but it doesn't really matter because we live off cheap oil, not of oil, but of cheap oil. And the maximum oil reserves in the world will have been reached in a couple of years' time. And after that, when people realize that psychologically, of course the oil, the countries with large reserves will then really realize they have something very valuable, which also the chemical industry wants, so they will hold back, they can increase the price, they have an enormous monopoly power, which is of course why the US looked around and saw that there were 3 countries with big reserves left. One of them they have now occupied. Second one, Saudi Arabia, they still have a strong influence in. And the third one, Venezuela, they tried to overthrow the democratically elected president once, and I'm sure they'll try again. So this is the situation. But there are other areas like soil erosion, for example, where what has happened since the Club of Rome report came out is actually much worse than they predicted. And it's interesting that, when you actually look at all these alternative quality of life indicators, alternatives to GDP economic growth indicators, they all begin to diverge around the time the Club of Rome report came out. So, until then, quality of life and GDP had about grown at the same speed. But since then, you find that quality of life stagnates or is going down, while GDP growth will continue. Why is that? That is because more and more of expenses, what is counted as GDP growth, are defensive expenditures to deal with the consequences of the limits to growth. And economic globalization is, as our award recipient Professor Herman Davies put it, a last attempt by some countries to escape natural limits to economic growth by growing into the economic and environmental space of other countries. And that is basically what, and private car traffic of 95% within a few months. it can be done. There's no doubt about it. You know, once the will has been broken.
สามีภรรยากับผู้ปกครองและลูกสามีภรรยาในเวลาในทางตนออก